"Sir, you're under arrest for loitering." Officer Jake Stevens' voice cut through the Phoenix evening as he approached the homeless man sitting on the bench. 68-year-old Frank Rodriguez looked up wearily, knowing that protesting would only make things worse. But what the young police officer didn't know was that this vagrant had once saved an entire platoon in the jungles of Vietnam and earned the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism. It was a sweltering June evening in Phoenix, Arizona, and the temperature was still hovering near 100 degrees even though the sun had begun to set. The downtown area was bustling with office workers heading home and tourists exploring the city's restaurants and entertainment venues. Officer Jake Stevens, 26 years old and 3 years into his career with the Phoenix Police Department, was patrolling his assigned beat when he noticed the homeless man who had been sitting on the same bench for most of the afternoon. Frank Rodriguez had been sitting outside the First National Bank building for nearly 4 hours, not because he was planning anything criminal, but simply because it was one of the few places downtown where he could rest without being immediately asked to move along. The bench was positioned under a small awning that provided some relief from the brutal Arizona sun, and Frank's arthritis-ridden joints needed the respite after walking several miles to reach this part of the city. To Officer Stevens, Frank looked like a typical homeless individual who was violating the city's anti-loitering ordinances. His clothes were worn and dirty, his gray hair was unkempt, and he carried a weathered backpack that contained his few possessions. Stevens had dealt with dozens of similar cases during his time on the force, and his approach had become routine. Inform them of the violation, ask them to move along, and if they refused or returned, make an arrest. What Officer Stevens couldn't see beneath Frank's worn exterior was a man who had once been Sergeant Frank Rodriguez of the 25th Infantry Division, a decorated soldier who had served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam and had demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire. Frank's military service record, if Stevens had bothered to investigate it, would have revealed a story of heroism that exemplified the best traditions of the American military. Frank had enlisted in the Army in 1969 at the age of 19, driven by a sense of patriotic duty and a desire to serve his country during one of its most challenging periods. He came from a working-class Mexican-American family in East Los Angeles, where military service was viewed as both an honor and a pathway to a better life. His father had served in World War II, and Frank had grown up hearing stories about the importance of standing up for freedom and democracy. During his first tour in Vietnam, Frank had quickly established himself as a reliable and courageous soldier. He served in some of the most dangerous regions of South Vietnam, including the areas around the Cambodian border where enemy activity was particularly intense. His unit participated in numerous search and destroy missions, and Frank's natural leadership abilities and calm demeanor under pressure made him a valued member of his squad. It was during his second tour in the spring of 1971 that Frank would perform the actions that would earn him the Silver Star, the third highest military decoration for valor. His platoon had been conducting a reconnaissance mission in a heavily forested area near the border when they were ambushed by a large force of North Vietnamese Army regulars. The attack came without warning, and within minutes, several members of Frank's unit were dead or wounded. The platoon found itself pinned down by heavy machine gun fire from multiple positions, with no clear avenue of retreat. Their radio operator had been killed in the initial assault, cutting off their communication with headquarters, and their commanding officer was severely wounded. As the situation deteriorated, it became clear that without immediate action, the entire unit would be wiped out. Frank, despite being only a sergeant, took command of the chaotic situation. He organized the remaining soldiers into defensive positions and began planning a counterattack that would allow them to break free from the ambush. But first, he had to deal with the machine gun nest that was preventing any movement by his unit. Without regard for his own safety, Frank crawled through 50 yards of open ground under intense enemy fire to reach a position where he could attack the machine gun emplacement with hand grenades. The approach required him to move across terrain that offered virtually no cover, exposing himself to fire from multiple enemy positions. Twice during his advance, he was forced to take cover as enemy bullets struck the ground inches from his body. When Frank reached his objective, he discovered that the machine gun position was more heavily fortified than expected, with additional enemy soldiers positioned nearby to protect it. Rather than retreat, he made the decision to assault the position directly. Using a combination of grenades and rifle fire, he single-handedly eliminated the machine gun crew and several supporting soldiers, neutralizing the threat that had been preventing his unit from maneuvering. But Frank's heroic actions didn't end there. With the immediate threat eliminated, he organized and led a counterattack that drove the remaining enemy forces from their positions, allowing his platoon to evacuate their wounded and reach safety. His quick thinking and extraordinary courage had saved the lives of every surviving member of his unit, 23 soldiers who would return home to their families because of his actions. The Silver Star citation signed by Frank's commanding general read in part, "Sergeant Rodriguez's extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army." The medal was presented to him in a ceremony at his base camp, with his entire unit present to witness the recognition of his courage. But the young soldier who had been decorated for extraordinary heroism bore little resemblance to the homeless man sitting on a Phoenix bench more than 50 years later. Frank's transition from war hero to homeless veteran had been gradual and painful, marked by challenges that were unfortunately common among Vietnam veterans. Like many soldiers who served in Vietnam, Frank had returned home carrying invisible wounds that would take years to understand and address. The hypervigilance, nightmares, and emotional numbness that are now recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder were largely ignored or misunderstood in the 1970s. Veterans were expected to simply readjust to civilian life without support or treatment for their psychological trauma. Frank had struggled to find stable employment after his discharge from the Army. The skills he had developed as a soldier didn't translate easily to civilian jobs, and his military service record was often viewed as more of a liability than an asset by potential employers who associated Vietnam veterans with the anti-war protests and social unrest of the era. He had worked a series of low-paying jobs, from construction work to security positions, but his untreated PTSD made it difficult to maintain steady employment. The nightmares and flashbacks interfered with his sleep, leaving him exhausted and unable to concentrate during the day. He turned to alcohol as a way to numb the psychological pain, and the drinking eventually cost him his job, his marriage, and his home. By the early 2000s, Frank was living on the streets, one of thousands of homeless veterans in American cities. The Silver Star Medal that he had earned through such extraordinary courage was now one of his few remaining possessions, carefully wrapped and hidden in his backpack. He carried it not out of pride, but as a reminder of who he used to be, of a time when his life had meaning and purpose. As Frank sat on the bench outside the bank building, trying to stay cool in the oppressive Phoenix heat, he was unaware that his encounter with Officer Stevens was about to change dramatically. Stevens approached the bench with the confident demeanor of someone who had handled similar situations many times before. "Sir," Stevens said in a firm but not unfriendly tone, "I need you to move along. You've been sitting here for several hours, and the bank manager has complained about loitering." Frank looked up at the young officer, noting the crisp uniform and the serious expression. He had dealt with police officers many times over the years, and he had learned that cooperation was usually the best approach. "I understand, officer," he said quietly. "I was just resting for a bit. I'll move along." Stevens appreciated that Frank seemed cooperative, but he had noticed something that concerned him. "Sir, before you go, I need to see some identification, and I'm going to need to search your backpack." Frank's heart sank. He knew that he didn't have valid identification, and he was worried about what the officer might think when he discovered the medal in his backpack. "Officer, I don't have an ID on me. I lost my wallet a few weeks ago." Stevens frowned. In his experience, homeless individuals who claimed to have lost their identification were often lying, either because they had outstanding warrants or because they were trying to conceal their identity for other reasons. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stand up and place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for loitering and failure to provide identification." Frank complied without resistance. knowing that arguing would only make the situation worse. He had been arrested several times over the years for similar minor infractions, and he understood the routine. Stevens placed him in handcuffs and began to search his backpack, looking for weapons, drugs, or anything else that might pose a danger. What Stevens found instead would change his entire perspective on the man he had just arrested. As he rifled through the backpack's contents, his hand came across a small, hard object wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, he discovered a military medal unlike anything he had ever seen before. The Silver Star, with its distinctive five-pointed star and blue ribbon, was immediately recognizable to Stevens, who had served briefly in the Army National Guard before joining the police force. He knew that this was one of the nation's highest military decorations, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat. He looked from the medal to Frank, trying to reconcile the homeless man he had just arrested with the decorated war hero whose medal he now held. "Sir," Stevens said, his voice suddenly much more respectful. "Is this your medal?" Frank nodded, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Yes, sir. Vietnam, 1971. Stevens felt a wave of shame wash over him as he realized what he had done. He had just arrested a decorated war hero for the crime of sitting on a public bench. "Mr. What's your name, sir?" "Rodriguez. Frank Rodriguez. I was a sergeant in the 25th Infantry Division." Stevens carefully rewrapped the medal and handed it back to Frank. "Mr. Rodriguez, I owe you an apology. I had no idea about your service record." Frank looked up at the young officer, seeing something in his expression that he hadn't encountered very often in recent years. "Respect. Officer, you were just doing your job, I understand that." But Stevens was already rethinking everything about the situation. He removed the handcuffs from Frank's wrists and helped him sit back down on the bench. "Mr. Rodriguez, can you tell me about this medal? What did you do to earn it?" Frank was hesitant to talk about his military service. He had learned over the years that most people weren't really interested in hearing war stories, and he was worried that the officer might think he was just trying to get out of trouble. But there was something genuine about Stevens' interest, and Frank found himself beginning to tell the story of that day in the Vietnamese jungle. As Frank described the ambush and his actions to save his platoon, Stevens listened with growing amazement. He began to understand that he wasn't just talking to any homeless veteran, but to someone who had demonstrated extraordinary courage and had literally saved the lives of his fellow soldiers. "Mr. Rodriguez," Stevens said when Frank finished his story, "I'm not going to arrest you. In fact, I want to apologize for how I approached this situation. You deserve much better treatment than what you've received." Frank was surprised by the officer's change in attitude, but he was also realistic about his situation. "Officer, I appreciate your kindness, but I'm still homeless, and I still don't have anywhere else to go. Tomorrow another officer might arrest me for the same thing." Stevens realized that Frank was right, and that his apology, while sincere, didn't address the underlying problems that had led to this encounter. He began to think about what he could do to help a man who had served his country with such distinction. "Miss Rodriguez, have you ever applied for VA benefits? As a decorated veteran, you should be eligible for housing assistance, healthcare, and other support services." Frank shook his head. "I tried years ago, but the paperwork was confusing, and I didn't have an address where they could send information. Eventually, I just gave up." Stevens made a decision that would prove to be life-changing for Frank. "Sir, if you're willing, I'd like to help you connect with the VA and with some local veterans organizations. I have a friend who works with homeless veterans, and I think he might be able to help you get the benefits you've earned." Over the next hour, Stevens used his police radio to contact several veterans service organizations and social service agencies. He also called his friend Marcus Williams, who worked for a non-profit organization that specialized in helping homeless veterans navigate the complex process of applying for benefits and finding housing. When Marcus arrived at the scene, he was immediately struck by Frank's story and his military record. As a veteran himself, Marcus understood both the challenges that Frank had faced and the resources that were available to help him. He explained that there were numerous programs specifically designed to help homeless veterans, including emergency housing, job training, and comprehensive support services. "Frank," Marcus said, You've been carrying a burden that you shouldn't have had to carry alone. There are people who want to help, and there are programs that are specifically designed for veterans in your situation. Within a few hours, Marcus had arranged for Frank to stay at a temporary veterans shelter, while his benefit applications were processed. He also connected him with a VA social worker who specialized in helping older veterans access the health care and support services they needed. But perhaps the most important outcome of Frank's encounter with Officer Stevens was the change it brought about in how the Phoenix Police Department dealt with homeless veterans. Stevens was so moved by Frank's story that he requested permission to share it with his fellow officers during their next training session. "I want everyone to understand what happened today," Stevens told his colleagues. "I came very close to arresting a genuine American hero for the crime of being homeless. This man saved 23 lives in Vietnam and earned the Silver Star, and I was ready to put him in jail for sitting on a bench." Stevens' presentation had a profound impact on his fellow officers. Many of them had military backgrounds themselves, and they understood the significance of Frank's service record. The department implemented new training protocols for dealing with homeless individuals, with special emphasis on the fact that many homeless people were veterans who deserved respect and assistance rather than arrest and prosecution. Frank's story also gained attention from local media, which helped to raise awareness about the challenges faced by homeless veterans in the Phoenix area. The coverage led to increased donations to veterans organizations and prompted several local businesses to offer job opportunities specifically for homeless veterans. For Frank himself, the encounter with Officer Stevens marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. With Marcus's help, he was able to navigate the VA system and obtain the benefits he was entitled to as a disabled veteran. Within 6 months, he was living in his own apartment and receiving regular health care for his PTSD and other service-connected disability. More importantly, Frank found a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for many years. He began volunteering with the same organization that had helped him, using his experience to help other homeless veterans understand that there was hope and that help was available. Officer Stevens also remained involved in Frank's story, visiting him regularly and maintaining a friendship that would last for years. Stevens often said that his encounter with Frank had taught him more about police work and human dignity than any training session or academy course ever could. "I learned that you can't judge people based on their current circumstances," Stevens later told reporters. Frank Rodriguez looked like a homeless man who was violating city ordinances, but he was actually a decorated war hero who had served his country with extraordinary courage. That experience changed how I approach every interaction with the public. Frank's Silver Star medal, which had been hidden away in his backpack for so many years, now had a place of honor in his apartment. He also began sharing his story with local school groups and veterans organizations, helping young people understand the importance of military service and the challenges that veterans sometimes face when they return home. The bench outside the First National Bank building, where Frank had been sitting when Officer Stevens first approached him, eventually became an unofficial memorial homeless veterans. A small plaque was installed nearby, recognizing the service and sacrifice of all veterans and reminding the public that homelessness can affect anyone, including those who have served their country with distinction. Frank Rodriguez's encounter with the Phoenix Police Department had begun as a routine arrest for loitering, but had evolved into something much more significant. It became a story about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, about the hidden heroes who walk among us, and about the power of compassion and understanding to transform lives. The homeless veteran who had been ready to be arrested for sitting on a bench had reminded an entire community that heroism comes in many forms, and that every person, regardless of their current circumstances, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Frank's Silver Star had been earned through extraordinary courage on a battlefield in Vietnam, but his quiet dignity in the face of adversity had demonstrated a different kind of heroism that was equally inspiring. Years later, when people asked Frank about the day that changed his life, he would always give credit to Officer Stevens for being willing to see past his homelessness to the person underneath. "He could have just arrested me and moved on," Frank would say. "Instead, he took the time to listen to my story and to help me find a way forward. That's what real police work looks like." Officer Stevens, for his part, would always credit Frank with teaching him the most important lesson of his career, that every person has a story worth knowing, and that sometimes the most unlikely encounters can lead to the most meaningful changes in both individual lives and entire communities.